Okay, so this is the exam review for exam 1, Intro to Sociology. So, really I'm looking for here is the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. So really what I'm looking at is what kinds of questions they're trying to answer when it comes to research and what kind of scope they apply. So obviously quantitative, because even just the word quant tells you it's looking at numbers, right? Using statistical processes to look at things. So that's looking at large scale issues, right? So, quantitative research is often done in like surveys or things like that. Statistical analyses of large data sets, which gives you, an answer to large scale things. Like, for example, is there inequality in wages between different racial groups, between genders, between whatever? You can look at the US labor statistics, pull, millions of records, and then apply statistical analysis to them to answer those larger questions. But if you were trying to say, how does one experience, racial discrimination at work, or, what are the specific factors that, women face in getting into leadership positions or something like that, that would be more qualitative research, where you're looking at more small scale questions, and your approach is typically just trying to kind of understand how the people that you're studying, how they see and understand their social world, right? So their opinions, their perspectives, their feelings, those kind of things. So really it's just quantitative is looking at more of a macro approach, while qualitative is looking at more of a micro approach. Alrighty, so ethnography, we talked about this because that's my favorite. So some of the advantages of ethnographies are really just that you can often study groups of people that are very hard to study otherwise, especially the very marginal. Meaning, if you're looking at something through quantitative research, in those large scale things, you're going to miss those very small categories of people that get kind of subsumed into or collapse into larger categories in the research. So for example, if you're looking at gender, then you're typically going to sort that into male, female, or potentially other as an other category. But since the other category statistically is so low, it often just kind of gets absorbed and kind of doesn't get represented in the research. So if you wanted to actually understand, what is it to be a trans person, you'd have to do more of an ethnographic research study, right? So looking at marginal groups that are difficult to look at otherwise. So like, you couldn't do a quantitative analysis on the undocumented because they're literally undocumented. So it would be very difficult to like run a statistical regression on something that you don't have the facts and figures for. So an ethnography often looks at very marginal people that are often stereotyped negatively in society. So other ethnographies will look at people like the homeless. So a lot of stigmatized groups that we kind of have a lot of disdain for in the culture, largely because they're seen as at fault for their own, problems they face. And so basically the advantage is that if you're able to use ethnographic research, you can kind of actually look at, like, for example, homelessness. Talk to people that are homeless, humanize them, talk about the specific issues that they face, and then it makes it easy to, reshape a lot of the stereotypes that people have about the homeless when you can kind of counter it with people's actual experiences, right? All right, interview methods, different kinds of questions. All I'm looking for there is that, just that you know the difference between a close-ended question, an open-ended question, and a leading question. So close-ended, right, is a yes or no. That's why it's close-ended. Open-ended is that you can answer in any response that you want. And a leading question is just that it has a sort of, what's it called? Phrasing to it that kind of tries to persuade or push the participant to answer in a certain way. Right? That's why it's called a leading question, because you're basically leading someone to the answer you want them to answer. So those are obviously the kind of questions you want to avoid in the interviews. So anyway, those are all I'm looking for there, so you know the difference. Survey methods, advantages. I mean, obviously, they're very easy to, what's it called? Distribute. because like nowadays you don't even have to like mail them to people. You could literally just put them in an email and mass email them out. So it's pretty quick to do because you just kind of like make a survey, email it out, right? And basically, they're pretty reliable as well. When it comes to measures of validity and reliability, they're very reliable. When it comes to disadvantages, they are not quite as valid, meaning they lack validity in some ways. And also, you're not necessarily getting the full range of expression from people because let's say you have a Likert scale where you're like strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. It doesn't, if you put strongly disagree, it's not like you get to put why you strongly disagree or, oh, I strongly disagree in this circumstance, but in other circumstances, no. So it doesn't really allow you the full range of expression. Let's see, experimental methods. So just the difference between the experimental group and the control group, right? Obviously, the experimental group is the one that gets the independent variable, right? The thing that's supposed to make a change in the dependent variable. And the control group doesn't. So we use the example of how in medical research they will use placebos, right? So the experimental group would get like the allergy medication, and the control group would just get like a sugar pill. And they'll measure how much the sugar pill for the control group changes, a particular outcome, the dependent variable, whether you have allergies. And then the experimental group will be measured against the control group. And largely this has to do with the Hawthorne effect, which we'll get to in a minute, right? But the idea that sometimes when people are just doing the research themselves, things change as a result of the research. So you have to be able to figure out which is which, and that's why people use control groups. All right, so independent variable, dependent variable. So the most basic sense of this is that the dependent variable, just think of the word depend, it depends on the independent variable, meaning it changes based on the independent, or at least that's what people are trying to prove, right? When they're saying that there's a relationship between two variables, they're saying one is changing the other, right? So again, if we're going back to the experimental method example from before, from like a medical perspective, then using an allergy medication, the independent variable, will affect the dependent variable, having allergies, right? Meaning it will reduce your allergies. So really any of those things. So it could be your independent variable could be studying for an exam, and your dependent variable could be whether or not someone does well on an exam, right? So studying is thought to affect whether or not you do well on an exam, right? The dependent variable. So the independent variable is just the thing that's supposed to cause a change in the dependent variable. I kind of give you the answer right there. Non-academic uses of research. Just basically that they're looking for a specific outcome, so they're not like learning for the sake of learning. So oftentimes we see this in Gallup polls that aren't necessarily just trying to find out what your opinion is, but they're also trying to sway your opinion to a particular candidate or a particular issue. And so as a result, they're often not looking at the same ethical considerations that sociologists are using when using this kind of research, because people are our data, so we have to protect them and make sure that we are, not hurting them in any way. And so those ethical considerations are really not taken into account in marketing research and political research. A lot of those things are looking for a specific aim. Like, for example, trying to sell you a product. So how can they manipulate you into buying that product, right? Value-free sociology is just basically a term that says that it's not that you're like, oh, I have no values, right? That's not what that means. It just means that your beliefs are not going to prejudice your research. So value-free just meaning being objective when it comes to your research and not letting your beliefs about a particular group or a particular whatever affect the outcome of your research. Hawthorne effect is what I was hinting at before. The idea that research actually has an influence on its participants, right? So the Hawthorne thing was that basically this guy was trying to figure out whether worker productivity would go up based on certain things. So he turns up the lights, worker productivity goes up. He turns down the lights, productivity goes up, right? No matter what he does, productivity goes up. And then he realizes eventually it's him. he's the variable that's causing the problems and the changes. Because basically, like any of us, if we're logical, if you're at work and you know that your boss is watching you work, you're going to work harder. So the Hawthorne effect is the idea that sometimes the researcher or the research itself is actually making it, like, causing the change that you're observing, right? So it wasn't that turning down the lights made workers more productive. It was the fact that they knew they were being studied made them more productive. Okay, the IRB is just a group at pretty much all universities have some sort of institutional review board that they evaluate all the research proposals that people do that are affiliated with the campus to make sure that it's ethical and that there's some sort of informed consent for the participants. And informed consent just meaning that before someone agrees to do a sociological research study, they know any potential outcomes that could come from it, meaning any negative situations or maybe even positive ones like being paid for it or things like that, that they understand the full extent of what the research is going to be before they consent to being in it, right? All right, moving on to chapter 4. What is socialization? All right, it's obviously just the way that we learn the values and norms of our society, right? So often we're socialized first by our parents. We'll get to that in a minute. Just that, they set up the tone for what things we think are right and wrong, right? Those values, those beliefs and norms of how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to feel, all of that. All right, looking glass self is Cooley's argument that basically people are mirrors who reflect back this other image of ourselves. So when we look at people, we see how they react to what we do. And so we often imagine ourselves in their eyes, right? So as an object. So you have like your internal sense, like eyeballs outward of your body, but then you also have like an external sense of like how other people might view you. And you also imagine how people perceive you or judge you, right? Based on the way you act or the way you interact with them. And we'll often experience feelings, either positive ones like, oh, I was rewarded by wearing a certain thing or talking a certain way or being a certain, performative activity is rewarded. So therefore I want to do it again, right? It makes me feel good. Or often, like, let's say you do something, you say something, anything, you present yourself in some way and people react negatively, then we see ourselves negatively, right? So basically, like, if you look at someone and instead of smiling, they're like, ugh, right? Then that's going to be like a looking mirror into how people perceive you in the society. All right, Mead. Moving into Mead. All right, so basically all I'm going to test you on for these ones of his stages are the play stage and the game stage, right? Even though he has like a whole another stage. But anyway, so basically the play stage is when you hit about like the toddler age, right? Like 3-4 years old. And basically they start playing the roles of other people. So they'll say like, okay, I'm mom, or I'm the kid and you're the parent, or they'll play roles like, I'm a princess, I'm a astronaut, I'm a firefighter, I'm whatever, right? They start kind of understanding different roles that people play in society, and they want to play those roles. So especially with parents, that's always like the first ones that they do. They mimic the social roles that they see. So they'll play like as if they're the parent, and especially if there's younger siblings, they'll often cast them into those roles so that they can kind of fulfill that power role of being like, okay, I tell you to do this because you're the kid and I'm the adult, right? So they're basically understanding the social rules by playing them out, right? And then Mead says once you get to the game stage, this is when you start to take on the perspective of the generalized other. Basically, once you hit like middle school years, like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and, basically like 10 years old. And so this is the example I gave in class was about playing soccer, right? Meaning that if you see kids that are like under 9 years old play soccer, it's just chaos. It's like rugby. But if you see them playing soccer at like 10, 11 years old, it starts to become much more like a soccer game, largely because not only do they understand their particular role, but they understand their role within the context of other people. Meaning if you're like, okay, I'm the goalie, so it's my job to do this, and how my job relates to getting the ball to this person so that they can do X, Y, and Z, right? So it's not just about like playing a role like mom or something like that, but it's also understanding how your role connects to all these others. And then you start to develop this generalized other, this idea of like how they will see you or how society will see you, which is just kind of like this weird imagined thing that we do. All right, impression management is the attempt that we have to try to control how people see us because we want to have people see us positively. So we use a lot of self-presentation and performance tactics to kind of control the way that people see us. So this could be just like how you prepare yourself to look before you leave the house. This could be, like for myself, if I'm talking about the role of professor, then it's more than just like showing up in like a blazer. I have to like know what I'm talking about, have read the textbook, like understand the concepts in order to relate them to someone else. So otherwise, if I walk in and someone's like, "What's socialization?" I'm like, "I don't know." Then that's not great impression management because I'm not showing that I belong in that particular role, right? And the example I gave in class, which I think is the easiest to understand, is how Instagram is like the worst version of this, right? Where everybody filters themselves and they filter their experiences, so you only see one part of their world, but that becomes the way that we then see them, right? So if their feed is just like super positive, they're always going out and doing stuff, we think that that's their life. But it's just impression management. It's that it's like PR for yourself that you're putting out to try to, basically say that, or to give out an image that you want people to think about you. So whether you want them to think you're a world traveler or you're a foodie or you're like super happy in some cute relationship or you're super into your kids or whatever the crap, the impression management that goes through those filters is like so extreme. All right, dramaturgy is just this basic idea that the social world is like a stage. So this was Goffman's term, where he basically said, social life is like a theatrical performance, right? And he said in dramaturgy, there's backstage and front stage. So backstage is basically how do you say that? How you get ready for the front stage, right? So think about it in a theater. Before you would go out on stage, you have to like learn your lines, you have to get in the costume, get in the makeup, right? You have to perform or do all these other things in the backstage so that you're ready for front stage, right? And that's the analogy he makes for the social world, that we have to really prepare a lot of stuff in our backstage performances so that when we're on front stage, we can control those impressions better, right? And so front stage was not just the performance taking place, but it's also the context of the performance, right? So in this case, like think about in a theater, you don't just, I guess if the play is like really boring, you just see people standing there, but if, in most plays, most theatrical performances, they have intricate set design that tries to set up the scene for you, right? So that you understand the context in which a person is saying a particular scene, right? So I think the example I gave in class is that, if we walk in day one to the course and, it's a classroom, it's pretty easy for me to define front stage as this is a classroom, you should be in a class. But if you went to meet me in the classroom and instead I was just out in the quad randomly and was like, no, we're just going to like sit here and kind of talk about these things, the context changes because inside and outside of the classroom have different social rules, right? So front stage is about like how that person performs their lines, but it's also the set that's behind them, right? Like meaning if you're at work, you're performing a different role in lines than if you're at home or if you're with your friends. You're performing different things with different sets or different props or different ways to kind of bolster that performance. That's like a really long way of saying I'm barely going to ask a question about that, but I just really went into it. All right, let's keep going. Okay, family, just that they are the primary agent of socialization, meaning they're the first people that socialize us. Like, we basically come out of their bodies and then they tell us what the world is, right? And then eventually we get to school and we are socialized through the education system. Part of that is what's called the hidden curriculum, which are the unintentional values that students learn at school, right? Meaning there's a lot of behaviors and expectations, again, roles and responsibilities that people have in different realms that we learn in education. So one of those things that we value, or that we learn unintentionally in education, is to show up to a place at a particular time every day. Right? It's a very scheduled time. You show up at this time, you leave at this time. Each class has a very structured time, which is very mimics the world of work, which is very time specific, right? Also, you have, the kind of values of deferring to authority, sitting down in your desk, kind of like the way that you would in the world of work defer to your boss, or things like that, that you kind of learn to have these different hierarchical relationships. That's the hidden curriculum. Once you get to a certain age, peers become the most important agent of socialization, right? Once you reach adolescence, like, we care more about what our friends think than what our parents think, right? For these two, these are just those video clips that we went over. The first one, the Jackson Katz one, is just talking about how in the culture, we never really deal with the issue of masculinity as a cultural problem. We try to say it's biological, that men are just somehow monsters that are born to, like, beat each other up or kill or rape. And we really ignore the reality of the social understanding of masculinity that's promoted through the culture, that links masculinity to violence, aggression, that, normalizes all that violence in, TV, ads, films, video games, everything, right? That we kind of just construct. And again, that social constructionist argument that there is no such thing as masculinity, we create it. And you can see this because each culture has their own version of it. And also the fact that in our own society, it has changed. Like, what it meant to be a man 100 years ago is not the same as what it means now. Same thing for femininity. These things are socially constructed. So all that means is that society determines for us what is correct, but it often changes based on how we actually engage with it. So we can just reject that and be like, no, I'm not going to be some, super broed out bro. And then it changes the definition of masculinity in the same way that women, if they don't want to be hyper femme, it also changes that definition. So Jean Kilbourne's clip really focused on how, she looks specifically at advertising, but just how the popular culture in the media as well constructs women as things, as sexual objects, and not as people, and how that has a lot of negative consequences for women. Not just that it normalizes violence and sexual aggression against them, but it can lead to real life consequences for especially girls that are coming up in a world where they see that their only value is how they look, and it's something they're told that they can't control, because advertising wants you to feel terrible about yourself, so you buy things, right? So they basically tell you that you're not worthwhile, that no one will love you unless you X, Y, and Z, and so buy this crap or do this thing. And so that really dehumanizes a lot of women, and they end up having a lot of harmful behaviors, especially like eating disorders, things like that. All right, resocialization is just when we grow and continue to be socialized, we learn new things and we're resocialized. So for example, going from high school to college was a resocialization process. When you graduate college and go into the world of work, that's a resocialization process. So it's not as if you just start over from scratch, but you just kind of build upon it your whole life, meaning socialization is not just for your childhood, it happens your whole life. Statuses. So here I'm just going to look at the differences between these ones, right? Ascribed, embodied, achieved. So again, really, as long as you know the difference that, achieved is obviously something that's given to you, embodied is connected to your actual body, and then ascribed is one that you're just born into that you can't change, right? Stereotyping is just when you judge other people based on preconceived generalizations about groups, right? So you look at an individual and you say, oh, they're part of this group, whatever group it is, and therefore this entire stereotype applies to them. So role conflict is when you have conflicts in your life between multiple roles that you have in the culture and just differing expectations about your behavior based on those roles. So I think the examples I gave in class was like, if you're a parent and you're an employee, then those roles can clash if your child is sick, because obviously as an employee you're expected to show up at a time and a day and all of that kind of crap. But if your child is sick, as a parent, you're also supposed to take care of them. All right, emotion work or emotional labor is just basically when you have to either elicit or suppress an emotion because of work. So again, elicit just meaning you have to like fake being nice to somebody. So you have to pretend to smile when you're not happy about smiling. And sometimes emotion work is about suppressing an emotion, so holding in your anger or not cursing a person out because they're rude or whatever it might be. And that's just become a common feature of our modern life because of the kind of roles and work that we have now, where we work service jobs, where we basically have to defer to one another. And saturated itself is just how oftentimes, because we're consuming so much media, especially nowadays, we're like in this renaissance of streaming media, that oftentimes you take parts of your identity from these different things. Like, for example, I don't want to say obsessed, but yeah, I guess. I'm just up there in that realm of like, I speak a language of The Simpsons. I have a couple other friends that are as into it as I am, where we often make inside jokes around other people about certain specific Simpsons references that are hilarious to us and no one else knows what the hell we're talking about. So you get some part of who you are from the accumulation of all this crap that you've watched on TV or gone and seen in theaters or read in books, or, you know, the music you listen to or whatever it might be, that you kind of start to develop some identity based on like, oh yeah, I also love that artist, or yeah, I went to that festival too, or those kind of things that you can relate to on that basis of taking parts of your identity from those cultural media sources. Alrighty, moving on to chapter 3. So ethnocentrism is just when we use our culture as a means to judge another culture. And so often that makes us think that another culture is inferior or somehow flawed based on how our culture works. Versus cultural relativism is the opposite of that. It's when you just look at a culture in its own terms. Instead of judging it or trying to look down on it, you just kind of say, okay, well, this is what these people in this culture believe, and here's why they believe it, right? Without it being like, oh, they're terrible or crazy or what's wrong with them, right? Language as a significant component of culture. This is just because obviously it's pretty important, right? Because we, I don't know how to say it right. Like, it's pretty obvious. It's the way that we can then communicate with each other so that we understand and have shared meanings, right? Because language, if we can't communicate and know that when I say the word communicate, you understand the word communicate and we have the same meanings around it, then we can't actually bridge those gaps, right, in the culture. So it's a significant component because it's how we communicate. Norms are just the rules of what kind of behavior we're expected to have or what's appropriate in our culture. Sanctions are just basically the way that we try to establish social control by getting people to adhere to the values of the culture, you know, so basically to conform to the rules of what's expected of them. And so there's positive and negative sanctions as a result of trying to control people's behavior, right? So positive could be like, I think the example I gave you in class was like, you know, you go to the doctor and you're a little kid and you get your shots, and if you don't like scream your head off, they give you a lollipop. It's a positive sanction, right? To be like, you did good, so I'm going to reward that. But negative sanctions could be, you know, a kid's really bad, so you know, okay, you can't watch TV, or you take away, okay, no dessert tonight, or whatever it might be, would be a negative sanction to try to discourage or punish behavior that's inappropriate. And we all go through so many of those things. We often think about it within childhood because those are more obvious examples, but this is something that goes on throughout our entire lives. Hegemony is just Gramsci's term to describe the cultural aspects of social control, where the dominant group becomes, not only do they have power, but they have the power to influence our value system. So we all end up valuing what the dominant groups value, right? So basically their ideas become our ideas, right? So if the rich value accumulation of wealth, then we all value accumulation of wealth, right? If the like the white supremacist notion of beauty being whiteness is promoted in a culture where the people that control the media, the people that have the most access and power are white, then they get to set the narrative for what beauty standards are, right? When you talk about heterosexuals getting to set the standard for what an appropriate relationship should be, or how those power dynamics work, or how it should look, or any of those things, that we come to see those dominant groups, the people at the top of the social hierarchy of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, whatever, all of those things, as the way we should believe things, because they have more power to influence us. Okay, a subculture is just a group in society that has distinct norms, values, and lifestyles. So what makes it different from a counterculture is that a counterculture openly rejects society's values and norms. That's why it's counter to the culture, right? A subculture could be like Trekkies, right? Like people that are super into Star Trek, which I guess, again, I'm starting to go down that slide too as well. But anyway, so that, like, believing in that or being like a fan of Star Wars or something doesn't necessarily mean that you're against society, like a counterculture. You just have distinctive values and norms of like caring about who these characters are or these particular stories or whatever it might be, right? Versus, again, the counterculture is going to be against what society's for. So like religious extremists, right, that purport to be representing a religion and then use it for violence and hate, which is clearly not what religion's about. Yeah, those are countercultures, or, you know, basically groups that openly reject what dominant society wants. Cultural imperialism is the idea that nowadays you don't have to go in as a military conquest. You can literally just take over cultures by the products that you sell, right? Basically that, it's interesting, like in America, because of our consumer economy, a lot of our products is spread around the world. So when you think about multinational corporations like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, things like that, we think of them as American companies, but they're not anymore. They actually operate all over the world, right? And so cultural imperialism is how we can take a product like Coca-Cola, and then it basically gets accepted into all of these other cultures, but what comes with Coca-Cola or whatever other products they're buying, and sometimes this isn't just products, it's media, like films and TV shows and crap like that, is that the values that come with it also enter that culture, right? So the kind of marketing campaigns for Coca-Cola, the films that have certain narratives that say, like, you know, men are better than women, or people of color less than white people, or these kind of narratives that are in our media systems then become part of that culture's imperialism as well. So it's basically how, you know, when we get other people to basically consume our mass media, to consume our products, they end up becoming more American without ever having to, like, you know, put a flag on someone's soil and fight a war. You just basically give them some of our crappy products, and they end up becoming more like the group that created those products or that media. All right, these are those two videos that we looked at. So basically, Milgram, his obedience study, what he did was he was trying to understand how, you know, in the Nuremberg trials, when Nazis were being questioned about, you know, following, basically going through with these horrible atrocities in these concentration camps, what a lot of the Nazis said was, well, I was just following orders. I was just following orders. Like, I couldn't disobey. I was following orders. So he's really started thinking about, like, what makes a person do that, to go against their own conscience, you know, just because someone's telling them to do so. So he wanted to test this. And so he developed this obedience study where he basically, you know, pretended that one person was getting electroshocks for getting answers on a word pair test wrong, but really it was just a pre-recorded thing of a person reacting to certain electrical shocks. And he would see how far people would go up the shock generator board, you know, even as the person in the next room is saying, like, no, stop, my heart is hurting, I can't do this, and they stop responding, and just see how willing they are to give these extreme electric shocks to somebody because someone in a lab coat told them to. Right? So really measuring, like, like one of the guys in the study said, you know, Milgram didn't want to do that thing of, like, ask someone what they would do in a hypothetical. You put someone in that situation and you see what they do. But of course, terribly unethical, because a lot of people got very emotionally upset by doing it. So it was a very, what's it called? Kind of deceptive research study, because people didn't know that they were being studied as to whether or not they were willing to go all the way up the shock board. They thought they were working on a word pair test, right? And punishing a person if they got the word pair incorrect. All right, so Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment was basically these students at Stanford were selected for the research study, and they were just randomly split in half. Half were guards, half were prisoners. And basically, they were testing the definition of a situation as a prison, meaning just a basement hallway, basically, with some rooms turned into cells. But it became an accepted context, right? The idea of a definition of a situation, when everyone agrees upon it as a jail, it becomes a jail. And so also the idea that if you give someone a role, they fulfill the role, right? And that the power the role has in affecting people's behavior. So just being a guard versus being a prisoner, at first it didn't seem like it was going to work. But then after, even the first day, there started to be kind of conflicts between the guards and the prisoners. And what's interesting is the guards started to see the prisoners as actually like deserving of being locked up. So they started treating them differently in more dehumanizing ways, where literally people started having emotional breakdowns. Again, why it's so unethical to do research like this, because you can't hurt your participants. That's why research like this could never be done again. But, the experiment was really just trying to understand, if, or how powerful a social role can be in determining how we actually behave, right? Meaning, if you're a guard, do you then treat the prisoners in a certain way, or because now you're a prisoner, do you treat the guards in a certain way, or really start to see it as you're trapped in prison, even though it's just a basement hallway, right? All right, chapter 5. Okay, so anomie, basically the way that it's described, like terminology-wise, is just normlessness, but I feel like that could be confusing. So basically it just means that if you don't have strong social ties, when things happen that are negative in life, you're more likely to end up committing suicide or just, basically not having the social support that you need to get through tough things. So anomie is just kind of having that social distance. A reference group is just basically a group in society that we compare ourselves against. So sometimes this means, friends of ours, like, oh, so-and-so's this age, we're the same age, and they have this, and that. Why don't I have that kind of crap? Or sometimes it's your family. Sometimes your family does this to you. Like my mom loves to be like, hey, your cousin, this or that. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Or sometimes reference groups are actually just things in the media, right? Like maybe bands or certain, artists or different groups or other things that inspire us that we compare ourselves against. Okay, groupthink is basically where sometimes if you have too many people believing the same thing, it becomes a negative situation where nobody says no or nobody thinks critically because everyone's like, oh yeah, we're on the same page. And so it's how, if there's like a lot of conformity, then people aren't going to feel comfortable to say no. So this can often happen in like kind of like CEO business environments where everyone kind of like, yes, that's a great idea, even though it's not a great idea, largely because no one has the comfort, right? Because they're all on that same kind of mind or like wavelength. No one feels comfortable enough to say, no, actually that doesn't seem like a good idea, right? Because everyone's there's such a strong social cohesion there. Social influence. Basically, for social influence, all I'm looking for there is that, we are obviously affected by the expectations and the actions of other people. So another way of thinking of social influence is something that we all have heard of in another term called peer pressure, right? This idea of when people kind of levy upon you an idea of what they think how they think you should behave, then it does affect how you then internalize how you think you should behave. Internalization is the biggest or is the strongest type of conformity, where you adopt the belief of the group as your own. When it comes to authority, I just want you to know the different kinds, right? Meaning, traditional authority is typically like you're born into it, like a king or a queen or something like that. Legal authority, obviously based on laws like being a judge or being a cop or things like that, right? They're based on actual established laws or even being like a senator or something like that. And then charismatic authority is when people follow you because, as a leader, because they think that, either your value system or who you are as a person is worthwhile to follow. So obviously you're charismatic. People like you. So that's why they follow you, right? Let's see. Bureaucracy is Weber's term for a group that's designed to perform a particular task efficiently with specialization, hierarchy, rules and regulations, and impersonality. So again, if you've gone to the DMV, then you know exactly what a bureaucracy is, right? It's obviously specialized, meaning each window does a certain thing. I mean, maybe most people wouldn't say that the DMV is efficient, but in fairness, they do manage the records of millions of people, right? And even in California, if you're going to a DMV, then they probably have hundreds of other people there that same day with you. So that's pretty amazing when you think about most businesses would not be able to, or, organizations would not be able to manage that many people in that short a period of time, but they're able to do it because they're efficient, right? They have very, you go to this one place to check in, you get this number, they call you from that to some other thing, and you go through X, Y, and Z, right? But you can't just walk in and be like, help. And people are like, oh, of course, come sit down. Let's talk it out, right? It's very structured. There's a lot of rules and regulations. You don't have the right form filled out, well, then you're not getting your license, right? That's just very how that is. It's very impersonal. So McDonaldization is building upon bureaucracy. It was Ritzer's term to describe how this bureaucratic rationalization has taken over a lot of our jobs. I think the best example of this in the modern day too is the just food ordering apps. Most places you go to a restaurant now, you have an app that you can use ahead of time. So you basically get on your thing. It's efficient because they can now have less employees, but they can still get you in and get you out quickly as far as your food. It's the predictability because you get what you ordered. It's going to taste how you think it's going to taste. The calculability, because again, quantity over quality, they're getting more people in the door, especially if they have those to-go options of you just park, grab your food, go. And then the control is because instead of even calling a place and ordering food, or instead of going into a place and ordering food with a person, you just do it through an app, so they don't have to pay a person at all, right? You order the food, someone's there preparing the food, but then no one has to be there at the counter. And I think the weirdest example of it is now Panera. Places like that, I guess McDonald's is the same thing now, where it's you walk in, there might be a human person there you can talk to, but you can still just go up to an iPad. And most people go up to an iPad. It's a weird thing we think technology is always better, but we don't think about the social consequence. When you go to the self-checkout, McDonaldization as a great example of that as well. You're making it so that they can have one person for 5, 6 registers instead of 6 people for 5 or 6 registers that they would actually have to pay and give medical benefits to and a retirement. So it's more efficient for the business, but it's also terrifying for us because then there's less and less jobs that actually exist. And the only jobs that do are either really terrible service jobs or jobs that you need very specialized education for. So anyway, McDonaldization is just how he's looking at efficiency, calculability, predictability, control. So yeah, that's it. Hopefully this exam review is helpful.